So this is, I was going to say a little different. This is very different than the presentations I've done before. It's still about early British stamps. Um, I think there's sort of a sense that collecting the British line engraved stuff, the early stuff, is a very technical collecting area. And tonight is an attempt to sort of dispel that vicious rumor. I've been doing some thinking after Gene's excellent presentation in August, and then the presentation that the RPSC did with Alex Heyman um, over the summer got me thinking about social philately and uh, the ability to do historical research, starting from philatelic items and then kind of looking at other resources and drilling down and out in all directions. And there's a lot of opportunities there. And I've found a number of items that I knew about in my own collection, covers and things that reveal a lot about social history and technological history in the UK in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. But I'd never really sort of thought about them as a window into that era, and a wonderful window into that era, because it was a very different era. I mean, when we look at history in the 20th century and even the late 18th century or 19th century, we have a pretty it feels pretty familiar to us. But when you go back to the 1840s, it was cool, but it was a very different world. So that's sort of where I'm headed tonight. And then the other thing that I'll be doing is looking at some tools that are available to us now, because as I've said many times, this material's been around for 185 years, since 1840, and it's been studied to death over and over and over, and books written and collections built, and incredibly detailed research on everything from the paper making to the printing and the postmark technologies and so on. But now with the internet and advances in digital technology, we have tools and information sets available to us that allow us to perhaps take another look at some of these items and try to understand them better. So my own collection, uh, primarily Great Britain of the 19th century, um, and specifically 1840 to 1880 is the period over which the line engraved stamps were produced and used. And Great Britain at that time was, at the center of the known universe in terms of the Industrial Revolution, social reforms, structural changes, technological innovation. There was a lot going on. And in fact, 1840 is almost, you could do a lot of research just into what was happening around then. In 1841, the British conducted the first nationwide census, I believe, in the world. And anybody who does family history research and looks at British resources, that's when the first comprehensive census was taken with detailed information about every household. And there were a ton of other reforms going on at the same time. The Victorians had, fortunately, there were a lot of prominent people and politically connected people and people of wealth who were interested in social reform and, getting kids out of factories, getting them into schools. Slavery was abolished around 1839. I know there was a lag before it kicked in the colonies, but within Britain itself, I believe it was 1839. So there was a lot going on technologically and socially. Um, so collecting, quite easily gives us a view into things like the Crimean War, which took place right in the middle of the period of interest to me. And in fact, right at the time when they were transforming the design and technology behind the postage stamps. Perforation was introduced in 1854. There was a fire at Perkins Bacon's works in 1855, 56, and they were introducing new dyes and things. And quite by chance, along comes the Crimean War. And so there's some interesting collecting opportunities there. You can see the cover in the lower left. It says Black Sea Fleet. and via Marseille. Well, Black Sea Fleet has some interesting echoes in the news of the last few years. And the names in the news, if you're following anything that's going on in the current war, are the same names that were on everybody's lips in the 1850s in England. Sebastopol, and a lot of other locations in the Crimea. There's opportunities to find correspondence and letters from famous people. I'll say not all of the items in this presentation are items that I own. This is from that Land and Sea program that was done about the Fredericton show. It's a letter that one of the people in that show found, that was passed on to her, and she discovered it's actually written by Lord Nelson in 1803. So obviously pre-postage stamp, but certainly a philatelic item by any measure. This is an item I've got my eyes on. It's philatelically, well, from a stamp viewpoint, it's interesting because it's an Archer perforation. So in the period between 1850 and 1854, Henry Archer had set up his perforating equipment in London, and was producing trial perforated stamps that were actually sent out to the public and used. The significance of this cover is it's from a gentleman named William Gladstone, to another gentleman named Benjamin Disraeli. So it's two very significant people corresponding, and quite by chance with a fairly rare and very interesting stamp on the cover. Another guy, and this is one of my items, there was another guy, Sir Thomas Phillips, Baronet, who owned the tower you can see in the lower right. That wasn't his home, that was where he ran his business. His goal in this period and into the late 1800s was to amass the largest collection of books in the world. And I believe he achieved that. But he also established a printing house at Middle Hill, which is where the tower is located, and started doing reprints of some of the rarer items that he was able to collect. There's a lot of correspondence out there to this gentleman. This is the earliest I've found in 1840, but there is some material I've got from the 1850s and 60s. A letter to Sir Alexander Campbell, Baronet, in Scotland, in Bona, and a baronet, so not a really not a person with real prestige, but nevertheless, in that upper crust of the UK. And this is a death announcement, and as you often find in this era, and this is 1842, paper was quite expensive. It was the single biggest cost factor in producing stamps and so on. But people buying writing paper, and I won't make any jokes about the Scottish. You find these letters from all over where people were thrifty. So by writing the letter in one direction, then turning it 90 degrees and writing the second page over top of the first, you save on a piece of paper, but also on postage, because if you had a second page, you might have to pay tuppence rather than one pence for the postage. I've never honestly tried to decipher one of these. I don't even know if it's possible. As I mentioned, the other thing that happened around this time, 1839, the British government centralized all the birth, marriage, and death records in the UK. So rather than being found only in the local parishes around the UK, records or copies had to be sent to Somerset House in London. And so you start to find correspondence. This is actually a letter to the registrar of the Diocese of Winchester in Hampshire. But the next letter, 1863, is to the audit office at Somerset House. So you start to find correspondence related to, people informing other people of deaths and other events. This I actually read this letter many years ago when I acquired it. I acquired it because at the time, owning a letter addressed to the county lunatic asylum just seemed to be the most amazing um, thing you could do. And in fact, the contents, it's an inquiry about a patient at the county lunatic asylum in Lancaster. And we think of lunatic asylums as being, horrible, horrible places, and they were, but they were a step up from not dealing with people at all who had these sorts of problems. And we've certainly made incredible progress since those days in dealing with it. But there was a period where, lunatic asylums were sort of the state of the art in terms of dealing with people. I won't say helping them or, trying to mend them, but certainly dealing with the problem, as were poorhouses and having poor inspectors to deal with people in the parish who had fallen on hard times. Um, and then another, totally related but unrelated development was because of the success of the penny postage, not just the prepaid postage, but the introduction of a uniform penny rate across the UK. Suddenly, it was a lot more affordable for people to send mail to each other, and it corresponded with a period when people were moving into the cities by the thousands and millions because of that's where the work was. As farm equipment was automated, there was less employment in the rural areas, and the factories meant more employment in the cities. And so families became split up and needed to communicate. So there was a real incentive for people to learn to read and write, to stay in touch with family members who'd migrated into the cities. But facilitated by this revolution in postage, which created a uniform rate of 1 pence. And along with this increase in literacy, came people looking for opportunities to make money, and the onset of greeting cards, Christmas cards. In this case, a wonderful hand cut Valentine's card sent in 1863. Um, and then there's a whole, industrial and technological side to the correspondence that you find. This is sent to a leather factor, the owner of a leather factory in Lancaster. This is an account statement from a colliery, a coal works, um, a tea dealer invoice, letter to Aberdeen with an invoice. um, and then 1874, a sales circular to Italy. And the details on this are not fascinating necessarily, but certainly indicative of the era. You've got grindstones and millstones, anchors and stud chains and short link chains for ships, and then all sorts of chemicals, alkali, soda, potash, and prices given in pound, shilling, and pence. Goods from Newcastle upon Tyne. And as I say, this was sent to Italy, so soliciting sales to the continent. So all that being said, one of the other revolutions that was happening at exactly this time was the onset of railways, and a major change in the way that certainly goods and also people were moved around the country. Um, so, railway philately, collecting railway-related philatelic material, is a long-standing part of the hobby. And this is fairly typical. It's a little early, but 1876, this cover is postmarked South Wales sorting tender. So this is a piece of mail that was sent, I think, from Cardiff up to the north of Wales to Pontypool. And circa 1876, this is the sort of locomotive that would have pulled that train. And we can recognize it as, it looks a little old-fashioned, but it's similar to the steam locomotives we had into the 20th century before they were replaced by diesel locomotives. The inside of a sorting car on a train like that was, we all sort of imagined, several guys with all these mail slots and going through bags and bags and bags of mail and sorting them so that as the train arrives at its destination or passes waypoints, they can unload the bags with the sorted mail or pick up bags with mail headed to their destination. So this is all, we all have we may not collect this stuff, but we all have a sense that this was going on in Britain and also in North America. The technology and the the need spread to North America. The thing about 1840 said it was not, it was 36 years earlier than the previous item. And things were very rudimentary in 1840. The train crossing this viaduct at the top was sort of typical. So it's these very simple steam boiler open care, basically a steam boiler attached to four wheels and some method of transferring the power from the boiler to the wheels. Um, Open and closed carriages. They had first, second, and third class from very early on. In 1840, up until 1843 or 4, third class carriages were allowed to be pulled at the back of freight trains. They were all open. Third class was always open, no shelter from the weather or from the cloud of ash and smoke coming from the locomotive. So the big reform in 1843 was they had to tack them on the back of trains carrying higher class passengers. Um, here's a picture, a group of people being hauled along in third class carriages. And the only requirement for these trains when they were tacked onto a freight train was that the average speed of the train must exceed 12 miles an hour. They weren't allowed to dawdle along at less than 12 miles an hour if they were carrying passengers. So, as I say, a very different era than the railway philatelic era that we have a sense of from the late 1800s and into the 1900s. So the big transition in around 18 in the 1830s and into the 1840s was from the 1700s. A huge network of canals had been built in Britain, built by workmen called navvies, and absolutely a phenomenal technology went into these, series of locks when there's grade changes, so you'd get 10 and 12 locks in a sequence sometimes to carry the canal up a hillside, tunnels that went on for miles in some locations. And the idea was to collect the waterways, the natural waterways in the map on the left, they're in blue, with canals that sort of took you overland and connected you from one watershed into another. So you had a fulsome transportation network across the industrial heartland of Britain. And these canals were still being built in 1840 and probably for a decade or two after, because there was a lot of interest in railways as an alternative to canals. But the technology, there are always people who thought maybe there's more money to be made in canals, and certainly a lot of individuals and companies that invested both in canals and railways until it, became fairly certain within 20 or 30 years that the railways were there to stay and the canals were, um, you know, not. Now, the canals are still around. They're used like the canals in Ontario for recreational purposes. It's a very popular holiday um, concept to rent a narrowboat and go on the canals. I was in Birmingham in May, and there were among the advertising posters all over the convention center was the statement that there's more miles of canal in Birmingham than in Venice, which blew my mind because Birmingham, it's nowhere near the sea. It's right in the middle of the country, and there's not a big river there. I think there is a smallish river, but you don't think of it as being a maritime location. But apparently, they have to this day more miles of canals than does Venice. This I just threw this in. This is from 1838. This is apparently a replica of the very first traveling post office circa 1838. And this was on a line connecting Birmingham up to London and Manchester. So it's typical of the design of carriages at the time, quite compact, looking more like a stagecoach. The people who designed and built these things are people who had built coaches pulled by horses on roadways, and they use similar designs and just change the undercarriage to the steel wheels needed for railways. And this thing would have been pulled along at 10 or 15 miles an hour. So apparently they had 4 hours to sort the mail between Birmingham and Manchester, whereas nowadays you'd have far less than that at the speeds that are traveled today. But at the time, it served the purpose. So the sort of the main topic that I want to talk about tonight are two covers that I've acquired in the last year or so, both of which seem to have a link back to that early era of railways, not the era of fast trains and sorting carriages and all that and special postmarks, but sort of by accident links to the rail systems that were in operation specifically in 1840. Both of the covers are dated from September 1840. This is the first one. I'm just gonna, yeah, there we go. This is the first one, September 1st, 1840. It's a folded letter. It's actually not it's a cover. There was an enclosure, but the enclosure is gone, so it's just a cover sheet. From somewhere in Wales to Manchester, to a lawyer in Manchester. And when I say somewhere in Wales, it's because there's a back stamp of Carnarvon, which is in northwest Wales. Any of you who were alive in 1969 may remember that that's where the now King Charles became the Prince of Wales. That's where his investiture took place at Carnarvon Castle. The interesting thing about this, I mean, there was a feature on it which caught my eye, which was the reason I bought it, and it turned out to be not a feature of interest. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting cover. The fact that it has a red Maltese cross, as well as a black circular town stamp over the stamp, makes it unusual. And just to give you a sense, if you have a penny black with the circular town stamp and no Maltese cross on it, that's an item that catalogs at 30 to 40,000 British pounds. So this isn't one of those. This has the Maltese cross and the town stamp on it, so it's not nearly as stratospheric. What was interesting, I've got the catalog listing on the right there. They say partial town council in black, sadly not decipherable. Well, I wasn't about to accept that. So, and the reason I actually got it was if you look at the lower left corner of the stamp, it looks like it has a torn tab there, which would indicate that it's a partial pre-cut, which some of you know is an area that I'm very keen on and looking for early usages. This is not one of those. When I got it and took a closer look, and we'll get into that, it's actually glue squeeze out that mimics a torn tab there. So it sadly was not a partial pre-cut, but the postmark became a challenge for me. And the thing with the postmark is that it's black ink on a black stamp. So you can make out some of the letters. You can see over the tiara an L and a C. Over the 1 penny, you can see an upside down a T and possibly the top of an A. Off to the left, you can make out the top of a Y and possibly a B. The problem is with a circular date stamp is where does it begin and where does it end? And it's one of the problems. But in this case, the challenge is that it's a black postmark on a black ink stamp. So, and then on the back, on the seal, it says North and South Wales Festiniog Bank. So that's consistent with it coming from North Wales. And I'm going to, I'll switch to Google Maps in a second if I can and show you where all these locations are. So this is this came from the area of Festiniog, which is right at the south of the Snowdon Park area. And Festiniog is an area where there's a lot of there's a train system running today, which is part of the oldest continuously run rail network in the world, and it was built to serve the slate mines, and we'll get into that. But this Festiniog stamp bank seal on the back of the envelope confirms that it comes to North Wales, and then it would have been routed through Carnarvon up in the northwest on its way to Manchester. So my first stab at deciphering the town council, I used a piece of software called Image Sleuth. There was an online resource for a few years called Retro Reveal that some philatelist somewhere discovered. Retro Reveal was designed for people who work with old manuscripts and documents going back hundreds or thousands of years to try and make out text and watermarks and other features on the paper. And what it does is you upload a scan, just a regular scan from a regular scanner into the software, and it uses all sorts of it filters and uses all sorts of technologies which I have no understanding of to create multiple renderings of the image. And in many cases, it's very useful. So, for example, people who collect penny reds, if you have a stamp with a nasty postmark on it that obscures the check letters in the lower corners, we use retro reveal, and it often will filter out the postmark and give us a good image of the stamp, and a good visibility on the check letters, and we're more easily able to plate the stamp. So I tried putting an image of this stamp into Image Sleuth, and no luck. It really didn't help. And it makes sense. Black on black is a problem no matter what technology you throw at it. So I said, I'll take it down to the Green Foundation because I'd been hearing all sorts of exciting talk about this VSC 8000 that Garfield Porch uses down there and is part of their expertising technology suite. So this is an image taken in natural light on the VSC 8000, and it's pretty much the same as the scan I showed you before, which is a scan that I did. And this is one of the probably 20 or so different images I took of the stamp, the corner of the envelope, under different wavelengths of light and different filters. And this is the one that ended up being the most useful to me. And what it is, it's a scan that looks at the height. It looks at the distance to the surface of the paper and exaggerates any contours or defects in the paper. But in some cases, it will show you where there's writing or ink that sits on top of the stamp. And I think what happened here was, because the British stamps were printed on sized paper, the ink tends to sit on top of the paper. It doesn't soak in the way it does on regular paper. So you can see in this image that the letters over the actual envelope have soaked in because that's just regular note paper, letter paper. Quite fancy. It's laid paper. You can see the laid lines, but it hasn't been sized. The stamp paper has been sized, and then the stamp image printed on it, and then when the postmark comes down on it, it also sits on top. So what you can see here fairly clearly is the letter W, the letters L and C, which were already visible under visible light. The next letter is H, and then, very usefully, we have the period, which denotes the position between the end of the name and the beginning as you go around the circular stamp. And then if we look at the letters that occur over the envelope, we have probably a T, and we now know that the T is near the beginning of the name because that period is to the right of it, and probably an A, probably the top of a Y, and then a B. So we end up with a name like that. And it's beginning to come clear why the Swiss auction house was unable to decipher the name of the town. Because, in fact, this is another tool which is very useful to British collectors. It has a database of all of the postal towns, and you can type in partial matches. So it's like doing a Google search where you only have where you've got wildcards. So it's like a wildcard search on a database of all of the GB postal towns. So I typed in, for example, LCH, and I tried some other combinations, and up came the list to the right of matches, potential matches, and right down at the bottom, we have a Welsh town. So right away, the Germans, the Swiss aren't going to be able to find this because there's no flipping vowels in half of the name. My butchered Welsh would pronounce it Tan y Buch, but I'm sure that's wrong. And if you look back at the name above, the partial letters, it's a perfect match. There's an N that was not clear on the paper, but everything else lines up. Tan y Buch. And in fact, Tawny Book is in North Wales, and this is an old Ordnance Survey map, and it's just west of Festiniog, and the seal was from the bank in Festiniog. So it would make sense that this would be the town where the letter was actually mailed. Although why it wouldn't have a Festiniog postmark, I don't know. I'm not a Welsh philatelist. Now I'm going to try and switch my share here. Let's see if this works. Living on the edge after the experience at the beginning. So this is obviously Google Maps. So just wanted to give you a sense of where we are in the world. So Wales is the lumpy bit out to the west of England here. If you draw a line straight south from Liverpool, that's more or less the Welsh border. If we zoom in on the north, you begin to see the mountains. Carnarvon is over here. So the postmark on the back of the cover was Carnarvon, and there's different spellings, and the spellings have changed over the years. The destination, the ultimate destination of the cover was Manchester back in England, which is over to the right. And so the question is, where is Tawny Book? And where it is south from Carnarvon down into this area between Port Madog, which is on the sea, on a bay, and where to this day the railways end up. And over to the right is a town called Mintrog. And then up here is Tawny Book Rail Station on the Festiniog Railway. So when I saw this, I started to get excited. I'd been to Wales recently and seen these old trains, and I knew that the railway went back to the 1830s. And I thought, fantastic, I've got a cover here, bought out of the blue without knowing where it was actually sent from. And my God, there's a link to the Festiniog Railway back in the 1830s. I'll just pull out a bit more. There's a hotel here called the Oakley Arms. Quite spectacular. And about a kilometer from the rail station, and more about this shortly. And pull out again and go to the right, and here's Festiniog, and the seal on the back was from the North-South Wales Bank in Festiniog, and north of Festiniog is Blaenau Festiniog, right here. And what it's famous for, if I put on the satellite view, these are shale workings. The mountains were absolutely torn apart here, starting probably in the 1600s to extract shale. So most of what you see there are piles of, not slag, but the material that was discarded when they were extracting the shale. And they go underground to get the shale, and then they discard what they don't need. And as you drive through this incredible scenery in North Wales, every now and then you see one of these awful, gashes in the mountainside and these huge piles of material. So that's the lay of the land. There's Blaenau Festiniog, and then we've got the Oakley Arms Hotel, Tawny Book sort of in the middle here, and then Port Madog over to the left. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Oh my gosh, it worked. That's amazing. So this is the Oakley Arms Hotel. And if you look it up on Wikipedia, it's a hotel near Mintrog in North Wales, original building back to the 17th century, once part of the nearby Tawny Book estate. Although its principal use has been an inn, historically it has also been used as a post office and a courthouse and other things. But as soon as I saw post office, I thought, aha, that's it. That's where this letter was mailed from, or where it was postmarked. And it was part of the Tawny Book estate, and the family that owned it owned the estate, and the manor home that preceded this building on this site made their money from the slate mines of Blaenau Festiniog. So everything connects to the slate in this part of Wales. This is circa 1900. This is the railway station on the Festiniog Railway at Tawny Book. Very scenic. And this railway, I've got a couple of pictures. This railway runs to this day. It's quite a wonderful tourist And not just an attraction, but a resource. It's actually quite useful. You can get all around Snowdonia on these old steam trains. These are two screen captures from a 1935 movie called The Phantom Light, which shows the railway station at Tani Book, which plays a very minor part in the plot line of the movie. This is a picture of mine showing one of the trains running today, heading south towards Festiniog and Tawny Brook. And the same, anybody who's traveled in that part of the world, this is the top of Mount Snowdon. And the same railway network runs narrow gauge cog railway right up to the top of Mount Snowdon. So you don't need to hike up it. You can just hop. This is actually a maintenance train coming up, not a passenger train, but you can actually take the train right to the top of the highest mountain in England and Wales. So I started doing some digging as to what was going on in the 1840 era with this railway, and very quickly realized that no, my letter would not have been carried on the railway because in 1840 they weren't carrying passengers. They were carrying slate from Blaenau Festiniog down to the sea at Port Madog. So when the mines first opened in the 16 or 1700s, they would have carried tons of slate down using horses and mules and carts. It was 13 or 14 miles to the sea, very laborious. So when railway technology came along, some bright light thought, well, let's build a railway, literally a way instead of a cartway. It's a way built with rails on which you run carriages with steel wheels that fit the rails. And you can do that without having steam locomotives. So railways predate the invention of the steam locomotive by quite some time. And the way they operated this railway back in the 1830s and 40s up until 1863, I think, they've now resurrected the technology and they're now running trains the same way. And the way you do it is you load the train up at the slate mine and then take advantage of the fact that the engineers who laid out this 13-mile line built it with a consistent gradient all the way down to the sea. And so gravity carries these carts loaded with slates all the way down 13 miles, and the guys sitting on it with no high-vis vests or safety harnesses or anything, they operate the brakes. So each cart or each second cart has a brakeman on it, and the guy in front is in charge, and he calls back when there's a turn or a steeper grade coming up, and they have to apply the brakes. And they have a system for applying them to varying degrees and then releasing them once they've passed the hazard. Here they are coming around a corner. And so then the question is, well, how do you get the train back up to the slate mine? And they don't do this anymore, but back in the day, they would have pulled them up by horse. So the horses would have they would have had a team of horses pulling the empty carriages back up the exact same railway. So the horses would have walked between the rails and pulled the empty carts back up the mountain. And at the top, they would have inclined railways that would be operated originally by water, using water to lift the carts up to the very top where they were to be loaded with slates. And these are photographs of remnants of the old incline railway at Blaenau Festiniog. And so then the question is, well, what happens to the horses on the way down? And horrifically, they put the horses in an open cart at the back of this train. So this is a modern photo, obviously, but back in the 1830s, you would have had all these guys sitting on tons of slate operating the brakes, and at the very back would have been an open cart with 2 or 4 horses in it, getting carried down the mountainside, taking a breather before they then turned around and pulled the empty carts back up the mountain. So all very interesting, but nothing to do with my cover or stamps in general until I hit the most remarkable coincidence. So this is one of the first steam engines that they ran on the line. This is in Blaenau-Festiniog. You can see huge piles of slate waste up in the background. Um, when the railway was first built in the 1830s, and then they started to bring in steam locomotives, um, there were a couple of businessmen involved in promoting this idea and pushing it politically because they needed to get backing in London and money and support for this idea. And so one of the bright lights, one of the I think two guys who pushed for the creation of the Festiniog Railway was a businessman from Dublin called Henry Archer. And when I read that, I thought, hang on a minute. I know a guy from Dublin called Henry Archer. So in the 1830s, he was pushing for the creation of this railway. And then in the late 1840s and 1850s, he was developing perforation equipment and trying to sell it to the British government. And they finally signed a contract in late 1853, early 1854. So this same cover I showed you earlier, the Gladstone to Disraeli cover with an Archer stamp on it. It's called an Archer because Henry Archer was the guy who developed the perforation technology that was used on these trial stamps for 3 or 4 years, and eventually sold the patents to the British government, who then had their own machines built. And that was the beginning of stamp perforation, the first perforated stamps in the world. So I thought that was a remarkable coincidence that, having gone down this rabbit hole, and, I've always, everybody loves trains. Well, some of us do. But finding at the bottom of the rabbit hole is good old Henry Archer. And then the second coincidence was in 2018, Karen and I traveled to Wales and visited with family of hers there. And we went up to Snowdonia and rented a cottage for a couple of days. And her uncle and I hiked up Mount Snowdon. That picture you saw earlier was one of my photos. And about a kilometer away from where we were staying was this cool little hotel called the Oakley Arms Hotel. Little did I know at the time that that was originally the Tawny Boch Inn, and that's where the post office was, in this very building. So two what I think are amazing coincidences related to that cover. And so, nevertheless, the actual cover has nothing to do with railroads, even though it's postmarked Tawny Boch. It wasn't actually carried on a train because they weren't doing that in 1840. The trains were being used to carry more valuable freight and occasionally passengers. But, an insight into that era. And I learned a lot about, because like many people, I had preconceived notions about railways in the 1800s, and it's not till you sort of start to think about the dates and the development of the technology that you realize, yeah, the technology in 1840 was very different. So around the same time, I acquired a second cover, and this one I acquired because it had nothing to do with my separation exhibit, although I would point out that the penny black has a cut margin on the left and a big margin on the right, which is an indication it was cut from a horizontal strip, which is one of my mantras, that stamps of that era were cut in horizontal strips and then separated later by the end user or somebody at the post office. And so you often see this pattern where it's cut neatly at the top and bottom and then more sloppily at the sides because it's a different person. But what the real some of the more astute of you may have realized that there's more going on this cover than a penny black sent to the Thorncliffe Ironworks, and it is an ink sketch of a railway carriage. And so in the auction listing, it came with an RPSL certificate that said there's no way of proving it, but they suspect that the sketch is contemporaneous with the cover, which was September 1840. So I bid on it and didn't have to pay the fortune I thought it would, because I know there's a lot of railway philatelists out there. And I thought, my God, anybody who has an interest in railway philately, this is absolute gold. I think what happened was because the sale was of 18, early British line engraved stamps, there were no railway philatelists viewing, looking at the lots or bidding that day because why would they? There was no such thing as railway sorting carriages and so on back then, or postmarks or whatever. So I got this and started to look at it. And my first thought when I bought it was, wouldn't it be amazing if the contents of the letter, because there is a letter inside, had to do with the design and development of early railway carriages? Because you'll notice the address is the Thorncliffe Ironworks in Sheffield, which was the center of steel making and manufacturing in the UK from very early days. And whoops, the sender was a guy named William Crosskill who owned an ironworks up in Yorkshire making agricultural equipment, and we'll get to that. But the first thing I did was go online and look to see, this sort of looks like an early railway carriage, but could it be? And I found this, an image of a Great Western Railway carriage, first class, because it's covered, everything's enclosed, and it's essentially four stagecoaches strapped together and stuck on a flatbed, and then three axles underneath. And the drawing is wonderful because, I mean, it's crude, but you can make out that there's a man and a woman in each window, a woman in a bonnet and a guy in a hat. And there's, details like the doorknobs and the hinges. So it's detailed, but it's not detailed. It captures the essence of the vehicle. And in my mind, it's quite clearly this. I got a comparison here. Three axles, four compartments with doors. So is the sketch contemporaneous? Well, it certainly is a sketch of a contemporaneous railway carriage. It was signed on the back by William Crosskill in Beverley, which is just north of Hull in Yorkshire. So about 50 or 60 miles from Sheffield, I think. And Crosskill, and here I'm not going to switch to Google Maps again. You can see Beverly in the upper right of the map here. Let me see if I can get my mouse going. So upper right of the map, just north of Hull, is Beverly. That's where the letter was sent from. And it was sent to the Thorncliffe Ironworks in Sheffield, which is the lower left down here. So it's in the northeast of England. Contents of the letter have nothing to do with railway carriages, alas. Have to do with lampposts and something about, in the postscript, something about pumps. However, the lampposts in Beverly are still around today and bear the names of Thorncliffe Ironworks or Crosskill, which is William Crosskill's company. So there's about 20 of these that have been preserved over the years, recently restored by the town of Beverly. And originally they would have been gas lights. So when they were first put in place in 1824, I mean, obviously there was no electricity. These were gas lights originally, nothing to do with the internet, and have been preserved. They're cast iron, produced at the Thorncliffe Ironworks. And I think the ones marked Crosskill were installed later on, and the Crosskill name put on them, even though they were manufactured at the Thorncliffe Ironworks. This is a sales flyer from William Crosskill's company. They mainly sold agricultural equipment in this era. I think this is from 1848. And down at the bottom, they list the thrashing and various other machines and patent wheels are now in use in Russia, Prussia, Germany, France, also Canada, Oregon, Texas, the West Indies, South America, the East Indies, Australia, etc. So this was the era when British were they were the China of their day, in that they were the manufacturers to the world, developing technologies, figuring out how to make them, and selling them around the world. And Crosskill's specialty was agricultural equipment, and I've actually found online images of Crosskill carts in Canada, antique carts from back in the day. So they were definitely shipping all over the world. And then ultimately in the 1860s, the company passed on to the sons, and there is some mention of railway carriages. So they did eventually get into railway carriages, but there's no mention in this advertisement, for example, of them building railway equipment. So it doesn't look like the sketch on the envelope was, as I first thought it might be, somebody at Crosskill sending a sketch to Thorncliffe Ironworks saying, here's an idea. Why don't we get into this business? And if you think about it, I'll just back up a bit here. In 1840, if you wanted to communicate an image to somebody, pen and paper was the only way to do it. No photography. Illustrations in newspapers and magazines and so on were all engraved very laboriously. So this was how images would have been and ideas would have been communicated, would have been in sketches like this on correspondence. Thorncliffe Ironworks, a huge ironworks in the Sheffield area, one of many, but absolutely huge in size. They originally had a coal mine. It's hilly north of Sheffield, so there was actually a coal extraction operation as part of the Thorncliffe Ironworks. This image is not from 1840. This is from the 1940s, just to give a sense of the scale of the ironworks, which is where all the numbers are. And you can see these numbers like 10, 7, 1, 11, and hopefully Klaus's audio is off. This photograph was found after the war. It was a German targeting photograph. So this was taken by German aerial reconnaissance over Sheffield, which was in the industrial heartland of England, and they were identifying potential targets for bombing raids because there was a hell of a lot of bombing over this part of England, the industrial heartland. But that has nothing to do with 1840. So having found no evidence in the letter of where this sketch was done, who had done it, and why they had done it, and going back to the RPSL certificate, which said, well, there was no way of proving that it was drawn in 1840, but it seemed to be contemporaneous. I thought, well, I'll go down to the green and look at this using the VSC. So my thinking was, if I could show that the address was drawn on this paper over top of the sketch, it would show that the sketch was put on at the sender's end. That they had a piece of paper with a sketch on it, and they then wrote a letter on the back and used it to send this image. And similarly, where the postmark in the lower right intersects the ink of the drawing, I thought I would take a look at that. And the other thing I forgot to point out earlier, down at the bottom, there's actually a title on this drawing: "Moving Carriage on Fixed Wheels." So it's absolutely certain what it is. It's a railway carriage. So back down to the green, fired up the VSC, and started taking images in that circled area of the intersection of the address ink with the drawing, the line drawing. And the problem with this, when you look at this, is that it looks like the address is obviously over top of the sketch because the line work is darker. But apparently, that's a very common illusion when people are looking at these sorts of problems. And there's people who do this for a living, apparently. And it's a very common illusion that the darker ink will appear to overwrite the lighter ink. And when you think about it, you understand why. That when the lighter, if the lighter ink came second, the darker ink would come right through it. So that's under infrared. This is using side lighting, ultraviolet. And in this case, again, you can see the darker ink appears to be over the lighter ink, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the address came after the sketch. So as with the Tani Buch stamp, I thought, well, let's take a look using the 3D detector. So this is a colorized 3D map of the line work in that area of the envelope. And you look at this, and this is what this machine that Garfield Porch goes on about at some length to anybody who'll listen. It is a remarkable piece of technology. So what you're seeing there is the texture of the paper, and then you can see the dark lines where the ink is and how the ink is higher than the paper. So this is these lines were laid down 185 years ago in ink, and this machine can pick them up. The folds in the paper, curving folds are just very slight bends or not even creases, just very light bends in the paper that are exaggerated by this process. So it almost looks like a hillside, green hills with hedgerows over it. But I assure you it's not. It's that area in the middle. And then this is another taking that 3D rendering and superimposing the inked lines on it. Again, a remarkable capability. But with all of this technology, I was not able to determine which line was laid down first from the texture drawings or from the UV or infrared. So it's a useful lesson that even though the technology is amazing, even though the technology allowed me to make out that Tawny Brook postmark, town council on the first cover, in this case, so far I've drawn a blank. I haven't given up yet. I'll be back down there and trying to figure out if there's other ways of looking at it. But I'm convinced that the drawing must have come second, that somebody at Thorncliffe Ironworks received a letter and it was an order for some lamp posts, and then somebody else came into the office and said, "You'll never guess what I saw today. I was down in Birmingham, and this newfangled train came by, and here's what the carriages look like, and maybe we should think about, getting into that business. And here's how they're configured." I also looked at the intersection of the postmark with the line drawing, and again, there's sort of an obvious conclusion that the darker line is on top, but that's this optical illusion once more that can fool the eye. The other thing that's sort of noticeable is that you don't get, when we looked at the stamp on the Tawny Book cover, the letters of the postmark clearly rose up off the paper because it was the sized paper of the stamp. And so the ink, and I've looked at individual penny blacks on the VSC, and you get remarkable 3D images because the ink sits right on top of the paper. It soaks in to some extent, but a lot of the ink sits and dries on top. What's happening here is the ink is mostly soaking into the paper. It's just regular vellum paper. So the ink is not sitting on top. So conclusion on this, I don't know whether the sketch was done before or after the address or before or after the postmark. So there's no indication, no evidence that the sketch is contemporaneous. The beauty of if the sketch came before the address, then it would be clearly a contemporaneous sketch. It was done before the letter was mailed in September of 1840. If the sketch is on top of the address, then it could have been done at any time. It could have been done, the day after it arrived, or it could have been done 10 years later or 50 years later. So that's not the main reason, but it's certainly a reason to try and understand what's going on. And that's it. That's all from me.